Dalton will not be offended if you interrupt and say, hey, wait, I have a question about what you're discussing before you move forward. That is absolutely acceptable. You can also use the chat. I do want to remind you all, though, that we do record these meetings for a resource later on. So just be mindful of that if you have your camera on, or if you come off mute, or just being mindful of that mute button on your microphone. And then once I hand it over to Dalton, I will share in the chat the link to where the recordings and slide decks for the professional development webinars, as well as the operational meetings are. So you have that at your fingertips as a resource ready to go. Angela, is there anything that you would like to say before we get started?
Nope, I think we're good. You covered everything.
All right.
I'm happy to see there's so many people in the room.
Yes, me too. Excellent. Okay, I will be jumping in. I want to reiterate what Brittany said. If you have questions, once I start sharing, I won't see anyone, so just holler. I'm going to ask for, input. Feel completely comfortable just unmuting, jumping in, or dropping in chat. Angela will be able to read that out for me. So, let's dive in.
So, Dalton, I did think of one thing I want to ask the group.
Absolutely.
Did you all get my email this morning reminding you about today's meeting? Thumbs up, yeses, nos, whatever, I'm good.
I did.
If you did not, okay, good, I'm getting thumbs up. Yay. If you did not get that and you would like to be on the listserv, send me an email and I'll either make sure you're on the listserv or we'll figure out what happened as to why you did not get it this morning. It could be there's some whitelisting issues on your end that may be the issue because it's a listserv with a lot of people on it, but it could also be you're not even on the list. So shoot me an email and we'll see what we can do. Okay, thanks.
Okay, y'all can see my tile screen?
Yep.
All right. So today we're going to be talking about from hidden to heard, supporting students with non-visible disabilities specifically. But that'll kind of have a lot of bleeding into a lot of different aspects. So again, I'm Dalton Byers. I'm an educational outreach and research specialist with ICSPS. And just for some kind of context about who I am and some of my experiences, I've been working with students with disabilities, both non-visible or invisible, and apparent or visible disabilities, uh, since being in higher education in a lot of different capacities, working in accessibility offices and student like academic support offices, now working and supporting the Blind Service Planning Council with the state, and a lot of things in between. And so I've have a lot of experience with supporting students, especially navigating higher education with disabilities. No one has to do this, but does anyone like have either personal or professional experience like working with students or individuals with disabilities in higher ed? Or like occupationally? There's some thumbs up, I think I see. And that's okay. No one needs to share on that one. So some of the kind of learning objectives I want us to kind of walk away from knowing a little more about, being more confident in, is having understanding of the history and laws related to disability rights, understanding the context of students transitioning from high school to college with disabilities, especially non-visible, being aware of the types of non-visible disabilities, as well as being equipped to support students with non-visible disabilities navigating college, transition academically, socially, and professionally. So we'll jump right into the history. Um, so specifically in the United States, because we got to have some kind of scope and the entire world is just too much. So um, the early 20th century was really marked by a sort of institutionalization and a medical model of understanding of disability, widely, which resulted a lot in like segregation from the public life of individuals with disabilities, viewing disability very much as like a something to be fixed and eradicated by cures, not anything to be, either appreciated that doesn't have like some, potential cultural value or like anything of that sort. Um, so then in the 1940s and to the 60s, there were a lot of World War II veterans returning from the war, and this spurred a lot of rehabilitation and employment needs, which resulted in recognition that access and accommodations are going to be necessary for the workforce and the education system to continue in the wake of these veterans returning. So early advocacy and educational reform started around here. As well as the civil rights movement started going into more full swing. And this then began to inspire disability activists to frame disabilities as a issue of rights, not just issue of like medical concern. Then in the 70s, we have legal recognition with the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which you may know as Section 504. This is the first federal civil rights law protecting individuals with disabilities from discrimination in federally funded programs. So this was a huge first step in access and rights for individuals with disability. A major name in this conversation at this time is Judy Heumann. I would love to just sit and chat about her for honestly ever. She's great. She has a lot of really important things to contribute to this dialogue. So if after this webinar you've got like more questions and things like that sort, I'd be happy to chat, but also do some Googling and read about Judy Heumann and some of her work. Great person. Then in the 80s and 90s, the civil rights milestones for disabilities access continues to progress with the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA, which prohibited discrimination in employment, public service, accommodations, and education, among other things. And so, again, the ADA is going to be another major law that students are going to need to be aware of, that we should have at least some knowledge on to help them navigate higher ed, because that's going to be the major federal law that they would call upon for access, for accommodations, and things of that sort. Then in 2008, there was an Amendments Act on the ADA that broadened the definition of disability and strengthened protection. And then now in the more present era, there's more conversations about growing recognition of hidden disabilities, hence today's kind of conversation. Things like mental health and neurodiversity are in more conversation and dialogue publicly, which begins to destigmatize them and things of that sort. But there's still a lot of work to be done. But more conversations about universal design, both architecturally and in learning, UDL, Universal Design for Learning, are other kind of things that are more in development nowadays. So big leaps in progress since the early 20th century, but still plenty of work to be done. For reference, the ADA has a definition for disability that I think is important for us to kind of review, talk about a little bit, is that an individual with a disability and or medical mental health condition is defined by the ADA as a person who has a physical or mental health or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of such person's major life activities. Two, has a record of such impairment, and three, is regarded as having such an impairment. And there's a lot of dialogue about, the strengths and weaknesses of this definition. It's very much steeped in a medical understanding of disability, which has its pros and cons. I'm not going to be here to exegete this entire definition and go to the nth degree here, but recognizing that this is what universities use as the litmus test for providing accommodations. If they decide to go beyond that and be more broad or more encompassing, then that is something that they decide, but there probably isn't super common due to legal accountability and things of that sort. So helping students understand what this means for them. It's hard because we're talking about impairment substantially, and regarded. Like these are all words that are kind of subjective to each person. And so helping students understand where they're at and how to talk to like either medical professionals or others to navigate this process is something to consider. So, why is disability rights and access important? Like we're all here, plenty of us, I think, almost 30 of us are here to have a conversation about this. So I think there's at least some understanding that yes, just as a baseline, it's important that people have access to education, that people are treated humanely with dignity and things of this sort. But I want to kind of just bring in a little bit of like data and statistics about like students with disabilities in higher education to kind of frame why it's important in that regard. The National Center for College Students with Disabilities provided a research brief that enumerated that 70% of students with mental health disabilities were not registered to receive accommodations on campus. And of those students, 1/3 of them were not aware that they were eligible for accommodations, which math means that 2/3 of those students did know that they were eligible, but did not then seek out those accommodations. And we can hypothesize as to why. I'm sure there are a lot of different reasons. I don't want to, create stories where there aren't any, but things like stigma, but also things like maybe it just wasn't necessary anymore, are both possible explanations. But it shows that there's a large portion of students with mental health disabilities who are not getting the supports that they are eligible for or that they may need. And so we'll be working with students who may be having to cover and overcome barriers that they don't realize that they can have help with. And then also between a handful of different studies, there's evidence to see that students with disabilities do not complete their bachelor's degree at a 7 to 16% like less. They have a much lower persistence rate than students with non-disabilities, and so that lack of accommodations or other factors are causing these students to drop out or transfer out at a much higher rate than their peers without disabilities. And so the question is then, why are we talking about invisible disabilities instead of like in this case, much of what I was talking about, it just kind of applies broadly to all students with disabilities. I believe, and I think it shows here that like invisible disabilities can carry unique challenges regarding disclosure, accommodations, and recognition. If it's not seen, it can often go unheard or unrecognized. These unique barriers can contribute to the lower sense of belonging in these students, which increases chances of like low persistence, dropping out, and it can also decrease their willingness or likelihood to seek needed accommodations because of stigma and fear. So frequently when we think of disability, we think of people like those in the top left image, amputees, broken limbs, needing like crutches or other mobility aids, people who use wheelchairs. Those are some of the more common. I even think of like in my brain when you need a handicap parking spot, the literal image is a person in a wheelchair. So that's very much what people think of when they think of disability frequently, but also people with disabilities can even look like those on the bottom right image. Otherwise, relatively quote unquote normal looking. And so it's important to recognize that maybe our eyes don't give us the full story of what someone is, dealing with and navigating a certain context with. So I may at any point during this presentation use a handful of different terms for our general topic of disability. Hidden, invisible, non-visible, non-apparent. I'm sure there are more. And these are frequently used by different communities to talk about a very similar concept of something that is not clearly, obviously a disability because it is not visible with our eyes as an outside perceiver. And so here's an opportunity for everyone to drop in the chat or uh, um, drop in the chat or unmute. What are some examples of hidden disabilities? And asthma, thank you, Stephanie. Sorry, I've got my chat over here, so I'm not like ignoring you all. Autism, migraines. Okay, yes, these are good ones. You have any other ideas? Um, oh, excellent. Yes, autism, migraines, dyslexia. That's a good one too, Paul. Anxiety, mental illness. Yeah. Oh, good. We're hitting a lot of the big ones. Giving y'all another moment. See if anyone else is typing away. Can you explain or will you explain what you consider a disability? Richard, you had a question earlier I just saw. We're about to chat about that. So the next question or the next slide here, I'm going to kind of show us. Here's some examples of hidden disabilities. So we talked about, I think someone said autism, for like in learning disabilities, someone mentioned dyslexia. That's another example. These neurological or learning disabilities, ADD or ADHD is a very, I think in high conversation right now, or at least in a lot of my circles, I'm talking a lot about with people who are getting diagnosed with ADHD or children with ADHD, and so navigating learning with those can sometimes look like there's nothing different, but how they process information and things of that sort. Yes, Ivory, I'm so glad you said that. Regarding being deaf or hard of hearing, sensory disabilities, I think, are frequently, I want to say forgotten, but like not considered a non-visible disability because sometimes it is apparent because of like canes or cochlear implants or other assistive technologies that make it more apparent and more visible. But also, if that person has those devices put away for any given reason, it can sometimes become invisible. So that's a very unique example of a non-visible disability that kind of depends on this scenario. Chronic physical and autoimmune conditions. Someone mentioned migraines. Great call out for that. Crohn's, celiac disease, chronic fatigue and pain. These are disability like non-visible disabilities that can especially have flare-ups, which is something to consider in these kind of conversations. If like one day they may be fine, being able to like function relatively without impairment, and then the next day maybe not. And in a similar vein, mental health conditions like anxiety, depression, bipolar disorder, OCD, or PTSD, obsessive compulsive disorder, and post-traumatic disorder, for reference for those two acronyms, are again things that may have triggers that this person has to like keep in mind and regulate and navigate new environments with that they may not be aware could cause issues, or they are aware they could cause issues and need to figure out how to navigate those spaces. And so, and think of this, but are any of these surprising to you? Or like, no, that makes sense. I expected that to be mentioned in this conversation. Oh, wait, super long on this question. I didn't even think I'd ask it. So, or anyone have questions about like, huh? That is okay, because I'm gonna ask another question now. So, what are some reasons that a person with a non-visible disability might choose not to disclose? I've kind of alluded to some of these things, but It may be easier if you decide to unmute to participate in this, but feel free to drop in the chat as well. Fear discrimination. Would obesity be considered a disability? I think that that's very possible. You'd be venturing very much into a conversation about like access and like disability and that sort of conversation of like, are the chairs just not accessible to someone because of their weight? And so I think that definitely is, if not directly called a disability, maybe by the ADA they may be wary of saying that, but socially and or like not institutionally, but like functionally, architecturally, could create barriers to education that need to be considered and navigated. I don't know if the accessibility office would be the person you would go to for that, but there are ways. So yes, I think so. To not regard as different, absolutely. Embarrassment, unaware that it is a disability. I think that is especially apparent in this conversation. Thank you, Brittany. Of these non-visible disabilities, sometimes people can go and be like, "Oh, I didn't realize not everyone thinks like this." I think a lot of people with autism or ADHD or other like learning disabilities may go very long stretches of time without seeking accommodations or even thinking that they would need help or could benefit from it because they just assume that everyone has all these struggles. And it's not until someone asks them a question of like, huh, like it doesn't have to be that hard. Is a common question I've heard my peers who work in the accessibility office like say that to people or unaware of this disability or how to get help. Yeah. Fear of stigma, discrimination, being labeled or defined by a condition they have. Paul, that's just such a great comment, especially that defined by a condition they have. Being different people have very different kind of approaches and concerns about like labeling either someone with a disability or a disabled person, and then fill in what that may look like, are definitely um, concerns that people in this community have, as well as like figuring out how to like what does that do for the rest of their identities and who they are as a person. So that is a very big question that people have to ponder. Um, yeah, and they may have disabled parents as well, which could add different layers, positively and I don't want to say negatively, but like challenges and strengths to that they would have to navigate. So thank you all so much for being active participants. It makes this so much more engaging and interesting. So thank you. Some of the things that I had thought of that why someone, especially with a non-visible disability, may be hesitant to disclose or seek accommodations is because there are stereotypes that are unfortunately common and can be harmful. They can come from misunderstanding or having a lack of awareness of certain assumptions of what disability should look like. Lots of these are harmful because they minimize, invalidate, and dismiss the severity that hidden conditions can impact a person. These stereotypes don't necessarily help students with hidden disabilities want to ask for help or disclose the challenges that they might be experiencing. I think a really common one that like I know that like sadly I've used in the past and like I just know people who use it like I'm totally OCD about that. Like yes, I do like order, um, but like I don't have to count um certain like things exactly so many times, so many ways, over and over again. I do have to count phone wallet keys, earbuds, other keys every time I basically leave a place constantly. I would not consider me having OCD, but uh, that's something that someone could be like, oh, I'm so OCD about that. And that could begin to show like, oh, I can still function, and I'm OCD about that. When someone who truly has OCD could really be like, oh, I Why don't I just deal with this better? Um, you're so young to have health problems is, I think, um, a very big uh like stereotype that needs to be challenged in this conversation because earlier we talked about like chronic illness and pain and fatigue and seeing someone who is like, you may perceive as young, being like, oh, you don't have arthritis, only old people have arthritis. It's like not true. Um, and just because maybe more stereotypically that's true, it's not exactly helpful for that student to then be like, oh, well, then maybe I shouldn't get any sort of accommodations for like parking access or what have you, because I'm not old. And so that's for old people. Um, and so a lot of these other ones, but just to keep us moving here, it's just remembering that the words we use create a culture that we need to be mindful of. So I'm not going to spend an exorbitant amount of time on this because I want to keep our conversation moving. But the students that we're working with early on in their college transition have come from high school and thus, or most likely have, and thus may be accustomed to specific ways that accommodations have operated for them. Like in high school, the school identifies students through assessment, that parents are involved, that they have an individualized educational program or an IEP, that it addresses their goals, that they have a team of people who assess their progress, and that the basic premise of accommodations in high school is going to be students having a right to free and appropriate public education. And so that's kind of maybe the context that they have, their frame of reference, which is totally reasonable because that's what they've been doing for the last, 4 or so years. Whereas when they come to college or university, these students have to self-disclose. They have to self-identify to the university. Um, they have to provide documentation, and this cannot be their IEP, their individualized educational program. That's a helpful document, but it's not going to provide the evidence and the like important legal documentation that is needed by the institution. Um, and then those accommodations, instead of being made by the high school or by the institution and like on a team, it's made between the student and the accommodations office. And so the student has significantly more responsibility and power in how the accommodations process operates in higher ed, which is both great and challenging. They have the responsibility to manage their progress educationally, as well as they are given the right to equal access, not guaranteed success. And so that's a huge difference in that it's about getting you in the room and getting you access to the information, whether that's, making Braille if are low vision or blind, or audio versions for, hearing impaired or deaf individual, or vice versa. Here we are. Anyway, um, but getting you access, not necessarily making things easier, which kind of leads to this next comment. I'm not going to read through all of these, but like in high school, there may have been modifications to their education to make it either easier or more appropriate for what they needed. In college, it's not going to function like that. It's very much going to be, no, here's the exact same stuff, just in a way that you can access it better. What, like, however that operates, screen readers or otherwise. Um, and so thus the students have a lot more individual responsibility in this. And then finally, advocacy looks different and access looks different between the two. Um, what once had a team, I've said this many times, is now there's an office that helps everyone. They are on their own. Their parents are not involved unless they fill out certain paperwork, and even then, it's still on the student. The parent, this then has access to information, not usually any decision-making choices. as well as faculty members almost certainly will not be talking to parents. They'll talk to students and they'll talk to the accommodations office, but almost always, again, it falls on the student to navigate that. Okay, so talk about this now transition to college. It brings new expectations, but also brings new experiences. So it's exciting, it's good, and it's going to be hard. And that's true for everyone. So some of the things I'm about to talk about are not exclusively just students with non-visible disabilities are going to be facing this. Every student is. It's just that these students then have other barriers that they have to consider and figure out and navigate in a new environment. And so, with this new environment, new barriers that students with hidden disabilities might encounter that they didn't expect or they weren't fully prepared for. It includes like in college, students must decide if, when, and how to share their disability, which can be vulnerable and intimidating. You all really hit it on the head about either not knowing or being embarrassed. Just they may be fearful of being discriminated against, especially in maybe like large conference or not conference, like large lecture halls where they're very used to having small classrooms. It can be really intimidating to be like, hey, I'm different. Or in really small classrooms where everyone can see everyone really easily. It can be there's a lot of different intimidating factors in that. There's new freedom in college and a different structure from high school that requires more independence and personal accountability, which is a great growing and learning opportunity, but can pose a lot of challenges. New environments like dorms, dining halls, student clubs and organizations, cultures and events can bring new sensory experiences and unexpected triggers. You think of students with autism or PTSD or chronic illnesses that may have flare-ups due to different like sensory like things could result in unforeseen triggers that student now just immediately has to figure out how to navigate. I know that a professional I've interacted with who has autism is speaking on how she went to a really big university and home football games were like the thing, and she sensory wise that was not going to work for her. And so even when she would stay in her dorm, somewhat not even near the football stadium, she could feel the like fans like cheering and things of that. And so like that's a sensory like aspect of living in the dorms that she may not have even began to expect. Like I would not have predicted that being a case for myself. And that's not something I would have even had to have considered. But for her, that's something that she now had to navigate. Like, okay, do I need to plan to be off campus during these times? Or do I need to like buy like certain headphones? Or like, do I need to block that time off? Like, she's having to think about all these events that she's not even attending as to how they impact her ability to just navigate living on campus. And so these are ways in which students with non-visible disabilities are impacted by both the things they are doing and the things that they aren't doing, and how that integrates them into the community at college. Each professor can run their courses differently, and so there can be some extra challenges in requiring extra effort for students with hidden disabilities to navigate, like, okay, well, I'm in this class, I need these sorts of accommodations. When I'm in these class, that doesn't really help me, but in this way, it would help me. And so their accommodations process and like specific accommodations can vary dramatically between either class to class or semester to semester. And so those are added like balls that they frequently have to juggle as they're navigating their own education. Um, and then as all students, they are also, expected to seek out friendships and belonging, find connection, which can be very hard when they're managing these other challenges like sensory challenges that, some students would just go to the football game to kind of start making friends of other, sports, like people who like sports. But like that's not accessible to them. And so trying to for them to figure out what kinds of ways they can connect with others that fits. So these students are navigating transition and have a lot of extra things. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit so we have time for questions. So what students need to know. So when you're talking with students and you're trying to support them, here's some things that like help frame them that they need to be considering is that they need to assess their own strengths. Having any of these sorts of non-visible disabilities is not inherently a extreme detriment. That this is not a prohibiting factor of them accessing education, that they are without ability. It is simply that they have either different strengths or that they are in need of accommodations to make this space accessible to them and that they are capable. That's where their individualized education plan may come in hand in that they can see what worked for them during that time and what didn't. There's a lot of kind of self-reflection and consideration that these students need to start working through, preferably earlier than later, but especially as they enter into higher education. What is working? What isn't working? These are questions they need to ask often. Um, uh, um, and then maybe in the past when they were in high school, they were assessed and maybe needed it, but they didn't ever actually utilize the supports. But then when they get to college, that might change, or this could be between semesters. So like there's some that started using accommodations and then stopped because they weren't that helpful, or now they're entering in a different course that's going to be extremely challenging for any given reason, and now they need to go back to the accommodations office and reassess what's helpful and what's needed, which requires a lot of communication and self-advocacy skills. Helping students recognize like that they may have a disability and thus need to figure out like how to talk with the accommodations office, or that they need to be persistent sometimes. This isn't unique to accommodations offices, but higher education, sometimes things fall through the cracks. I like to believe that it's not due to maliciousness or like, dramatic neglect, but just simply there's a lot going on. ISU, for example, has like 20 to 25,000 people, and the student accommodations office does not have thousands of employees. And so, like, there's just going to be a lot on these people's plates, and so they can miss things. They're human. So reminding those students that just because their first email wasn't immediately responded with at a 10-step plan where they've got everything set up and like, they just go on their merry way, like that doesn't mean that they're without hope and that everything is lost. It's just that maybe you need to send a reminder email. What does that look like? Like, let's talk through that. Uh, and then kind of helping them recognize that connecting to accommodations is not your last resort. A lot of students kind of perceive, especially because of the sorts of like either unawareness of their disability or their fear of discrimination or stigma, think that I will only go to the accommodations office when it is absolutely dire. Otherwise, I'm gonna like grit my teeth and I'm just gonna like keep pushing it and keep pushing, and I'm gonna like rush and maybe skip some questions in these tests because I don't have the time because of, whatever reason. Or I'm gonna, duct tape and WD-40 my way through these classes. Start with accommodations and then use them as it's helpful. That is a great option, and the professionals in the accommodations office will love that, because that means that if a big test comes up and you're like, nope, I do need that additional time or that's like quiet space so I can focus easier. It's not the day before midterms and you're like, hi, I have 3 midterms tomorrow and I need extra time and I need to have this space, and they're like, well, literally not possible, even if we had everything, because we don't have the space because we didn't plan for that. It takes time. And so doing this early on in the semester, it's going to be busy early on. So if you can do it before, that's even better. But like do it well before you need the help. Helping students plan ahead is honestly super needed for all of them, but especially in contexts where there's a lot more layers that need to be considered. And then helping students, they need to recognize that they do need to build a support network. That includes peer mentors, family, faculty, staff, people on this call. So helping them recognize that everyone is rooting for their success. They need just have to take those extra steps of getting connected to that. Okay, I've been doing a lot of talking. If you've zoned me out, please re-enter because this is, I think, a one of the most important things, and probably should have been said at the very first, is that disability is the largest minority group in the U.S. And it's considered a minority group, but literally anyone, yes, even you and me, at any time can, and I would even venture to say will become a part of this community. Disability does not discriminate against race, ethnicity, age, socioeconomic status, or any other determined like distinction that we like to create to make us feel like we may be protected. Um, it'll come for you. Is what my friend in the disability or access office just said to me, and I was like, that is ominous. But I think a really important like framing statement of like, no, everyone will become disabled at some point in their life, temporarily, visibly, invisibly, or otherwise. It is just a fact of life. And so, if the statistics earlier stated or any other like just personal beliefs or commitments that you have didn't convince you that this conversation that we've been having for the last 40 minutes was necessary, um, you'll be in need of these things at some point in your life, whether in education or otherwise. So, I hope that wasn't too ominous and horror inspiring, but here we are. So then what do we need to know and do? We need to help students develop self-advocacy. I kind of already alluded to this a lot, but I think a big aspect of this is that disability is not a bad word. We don't need to get inherently be anxious or scared as soon as a student says, I have a disability or I am a disabled person. We don't need to immediately panic. And sometimes when students are telling you this, it is not because they are like, and now please navigate me through every section of the ADA and the nuances of legal interpretation. It's like, no, they probably aren't usually asking you that question. And they may not even be asking, like, hey, now help me find a cheat code through all my classes. They're also not asking that. Sometimes they're literally just saying, here's a part of my identity. Like, witness me. Don't then jump into those stereotypes or just be a like, and this is kind of bleeding into that receive self-disclosure well, just be an empathetic person who hears them as to who they are. But also, maybe they just need a very temporary, like, help me get my body from this location to that location because I'm having like a flare up of some sort of either physical or mental health um, like issue. Or it is like, no, help me. Where's the disability office even at? Like, because I feel like they're located all kinds of random places and so many campuses. And so maybe they just don't know where to go, literally. So sometimes it's very practical. Sometimes it's a lot more, I want to say bureaucratic, but like systems, institutional knowledge. So helping them find where they need to be. Um, Creating an inclusive environment cannot be done by any one person on this call. Um, we have to do that as a community. At your institution, it can't just be the accommodations office who worries about students with disabilities. That's wholly insufficient. And so having a widespread awareness and commitment to supporting an environment where students with disabilities feel like they can be themselves and disclose their struggles is important. And then some general accessibility matters just to keep in mind. There's we could talk about this forever. And there's more qualified people to talk about it than me in that regard. But consider if you're someone who's doing a lot of like student involvement, that maybe different kinds of events are important. Yes, let's encourage students to go to the big football games and throw these big like parties that are like fun with inflatables and loud noises and music and all that jazz. But also like maybe having some maybe more lo-fi kinds of events where students can mingle quietly and engage like reflectively or things of that sort. Maybe some that are more active and mobile, and maybe others that are maybe more stationary or lower impact. These are just different kinds of ways to think about like how are we considering more and different ways of engaging with our students to build community. Um, and I think, again, one of the other most important things I want us to consider here is that we can't remove every single barrier, but our role is to make sure that students do not face them alone. And so that's the meat and the potatoes here. I have some additional resources, um, different podcasts, some videos. Crip Camp is a uh, documentary. Um, with Judy Human in it. So if you're interested in learning more about her as well as civil rights activism with disability rights, Crip Camp will be a good reference there. And some of the briefs that I mentioned earlier. So, do you have any questions? Discussion? We have the slideshow.
Quiet.
Yeah, we'll be the link that Brittany shared, I'll reshare it right now. We'll soon have the recording of today's presentation as well as the slides. So you'll have access to that soon.
I will say your it's coming for you was a little ominous, and I'm like, well, it's probably an accurate statement. And then
Yeah.
you think back and you're like, oh yeah, there have been various times,
Mhm.
the easy ones to find are the physical ones, you
Yeah.
know, after a surgery, after a car accident, after some of those things that you're like, oh yeah, that does qualify. But
Hmm.
yes,
Yeah, yep, and disability is both visible and invisible. And another one that I, kind of alluded to is that kind of temporary,
right.
um, you know, pregnant women, or have eligible accommodations for like parking passes and things of that sort sometimes. Someone in our office has one of those right now. And so like it's important to recognize that you can even come in and out of having disabilities. We got some people coming off camera. Is that because you've got some questions or want to make comments?
I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time to
Mhm.
explain us all of this. Amazing. Uh, thank you so much. Extremely helpful.
Oh, thank you so much.
So I'm okay giving you all 5 or 10 minutes back in your day. I mean, we've all got enough stuff going right now that another 5 minutes or 10 minutes can be helpful. Um, December, we will be meeting again. We'll have another professional development. The topic that day, and I intentionally did not include the topic this morning in the email because I wasn't entirely certain what Dalton was gonna talk about, and so I didn't want to throw something out there and then he'd be like, "No, no, no, that's not right. That's not what my presentation is at all." So, but December, the plan is we're going to do kind of cover two smaller topics at once. Um, not at once. The first half, I believe, is going to be around how CTE programs and the IBT grant can possibly connect. And then the second half will be yours truly, me, and possibly Emma, talking about some various budget topics, ways to spend money. We've seen your reports. Some of you have reported back as to how you're planning on spending out money. But sometimes it's also helpful to see what others are doing with their budgets. So, oh, I can do that. Oh, that is allowable. Oh, that's an option. Because often we get in our, for lack of a better term, a rut, and this is just what we're going to do with it. Well, but then you end up with some extra money, and what can you do with that? How can that look? So that's going to be December's focus. And then January is an operational meeting, so no professional development meeting that month. But at that point in January, we're going to be wrapping up quarter 4, out of 5. We're coming to the end of this year. I can't believe we're already in November. Almost, we're over halfway done with November already. But that's where we are. So thank you, Dalton, for your presentation today. Again, if you did not get my email this morning, reach out to me, because you should have, and maybe you don't, you're not on the listserv, but I sent it to the IBT FY25 listserv. So if you didn't get it, let me know. We can see what we can do to figure out why you're not on it or how to get it, find it in your email. Otherwise, thank you very much. Go have a happy Tuesday. And we will see everybody next month. Have a wonderful holiday break. Thanksgiving.
Happy holidays. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.